Hey guys, MrPokke here, back with another video, and on today's episode, it's gonna be the first series where we talk about how do you build a proper team in Wuthering Waves, as well as going into the next video, we're gonna be talking about the CN version 1.0 tier list. I figured it would be a better way for me to demonstrate exactly how team building works first before we jump into exactly how a tier list will look like, because before you understand team building, you're not gonna understand tier list that much, right? So without further ado, let's get into today's content.
Subscribe!
Alright, so this is gonna be coming from the same video which has discussed their CN tier list, but I'm going to be talking about the tier list in a separate video. Essentially, it is one of the most popular Wuthering Waves video right now with over 1.2, almost 1.3 million views right now. So it is very popular. So let's just jump into exactly how team building works in Wuthering Waves from our CN content creators, right? So this is going to be in the start. Basically, it's completely normal to use our beginner teams of our main, right, Rover, Chixia, as well as Baizhi. These three units, you can use them to pretty much clear every single content when it comes to the overworld, because the mobs in this game right now, especially the early start, it is not that difficult. Towards the end, when you get more and more in your union level, particularly at union level 20, 30, or even 40, the mobs will get progressively harder, especially if you do not develop your units more enough, right? But for the unit development side, it is not going to be the topic of today, because it is only about team building. How exactly do you pair your units together in order to achieve the best of their capabilities, right? So there's going to be a more generic portion as well as a more specific portion. So the more generic portion is going to be, this is going to be their Tower of Adversity, where it refreshes apparently every 2 weeks. So 每2周, this is going to be every 2 weeks, it's going to be Tower of Adversity. So this team building is absolutely crucial in order for you to clear the most difficult content in Wuthering Waves, which is Tower of Adversity. Some may say holographic memories, right? The holograms, they are even more difficult, but the thing is, those are one-time clear events. You're not going to be repeating them every single time. The moment you clear them, you're going to move on. But for Tower of Adversity, it's something that is basically Spiral Abyss. You're going to be doing them every other 2 weeks, permanent endgame, refreshing. So team building is very important to make sure exactly how do you go play and clear these endgame content, right? But that's just the summary of it, and jumping into roughly the basic portion of a team building is going to be this: a main DPS, a sub DPS, and a support / sustain. To simplify this, for this slot over here, you can completely ignore them, because this support / sustain, there's only 2 picks: Baizhi / Verena. We do not have any other alternatives. So every single team, you are probably gonna be running them, except for some very niche comps such as Taoqi / Danjing, a no-hit run, right? Most team comps, you are gonna be running a support / sustain, and for that, the only 2 units that will change fundamentally are gonna be your main DPS and your sub DPS. And what exactly defines as these 3 units, right? What is the main DPS, what is the sub DPS, and what is the support / sustain? So the fundamental portion of this route of team building in Wuthering Waves is that your main DPS, it is the unit that's gonna be on battlefield with the highest amount of portion of damage. So think of this as like a little pie chart, right? There's 3 team members. Your support probably gonna do absolutely no damage because it's just a sustain, doing nothing, right? So, but the support's function / healer, your Verena / Badger, their role is to buff your sub DPS and your main DPS. So in the pie chart, the support proportion is like 0, but the buffs is buffing your sub DPS and main DPS. Your main DPS will be the one that is most of the time, majority of the time, 70%, 80% of the total damage output is going to be coming from your main DPS, right? So they are the highest average damage output, as well as the highest average time you're going to be seeing them on battle, right? So they are the core of your team, and generally speaking, unlike Honkai Star Rail, where your units are determined by your supports, right? Your team building in Star Rail, it is determined by what kind of supports you run. If you run a break team, you run Super Break with Harmony MC and Rame. If you want to run a dual DPS with follow-up team, you're going to run Robin. If you want to run Hyper Carry, you're probably going to run Sparkle team, right? But in Wuthering Waves, team building is not determined by supports. Team building is determined by your main DPS, because they are the core that determines what sub DPS do you run to pair up with your main DPS. Everybody doesn't run the same support right now because we only have these 2 supports. Then your sub DPS are the ones that are going to be tied to which DPS they are best installed with, right? So main DPS is the core of the Wuthering Waves team building, right? So first, pick your main DPS and then build a team around your said main DPS. So usually, how do you determine if a unit is a main DPS or a sub DPS? So usually with more than 10 seconds of burst damage, or you're gonna be on the battlefield at any single instance more than 10 seconds, and high multipliers from the skills. Usually, if these units fulfill these two criteria, then they are your main DPS, right? Very big multipliers, huge damage output, and they do not have any, I guess, a point number 3, I'm not sure if they mentioned, is that they do not have supportive capabilities themselves, which means their intro and outro skill usually is a raw damage output, right? They just do as much damage as possible. They don't really benefit your sub DPS or your main support, because that's the roles of a sub DPS and support. Your sub DPS is a secondary support-ish that buffs your main DPS, while your healer / sustain buffs your entire team, right? So that is going to be that. For your main DPS, these are the units in Wuthering Waves that are considered as a main DPS. Encore, Calchero, Lingyang, Jiyan, Chixia, as well as Danjing, right? So amongst any of these 6 units, they will form the core of your team, and you should only be running your main DPS with another sub DPS. You shouldn't be running 2 main DPS at the same time, because they are not synergistic with one another. Think of it as you wouldn't run Scylla and Jingyuan on the same team. Or you wouldn't run like what's like another example? You wouldn't run Imbibitor Lune and Jingnu at the same team, right? You wouldn't run 2 main DPS at the same team, because they fundamentally do not pair well with one another, because they do not buff one another. The name of the game in team building is to make sure that your 2 other units revolve around your main DPS and buff up your main DPS damage as high as humanly possible. Your sub DPS does a little bit, but your buff from your sub DPS is still focused on your main DPS. So your main DPS, they are generally gonna be from these 6 units, right? So any of these 6 units is completely fine to run them. You can clear the game, no issues whatsoever, right? If you really like Ling Yang, right, for example, and people are saying that if you get rid of just reroll, don't need to reroll. He's still fine. You can use him to clear the game. So that's going to be up to preference. So these 6 units are going to be the core of your main DPS. Any of these 6 units will function as a main DPS. Okay, before we go into sub DPS, right now, at the start of Wuthering Waves in 1.0, these are the only 6 main DPS you have. But in the future, if they release more and more main DPS, then that's going to be something we can look forward to. Right? So for now, we only have these 6 choices as a classic main DPS. So going into the sub DPS, we have a little bit more variety. And you can notice that majority of our sub DPS actually belongs to a 4-star. Until we get Yingling, Jianxing is our only sub DPS kind of thing. And she's not exactly a sub DPS. She is a Dun Fuxi, which is basically a defensive sub DPS. And the reason why you would, I guess generally for team building, you would prefer a traditional sub DPS is that they provide buffs. They provide buffs that are considered as offensive or utility buffs that enhances your overall total damage output, especially for your main DPS. So for example, your Sanhua, she can buff your next main DPS's basic attack damage deepen by a specific amount, right? I believe it's 36%. Yep, 38%, my bad. Right, so for Sanhua, she buffs your next unit's basic attack damage deepen 38% for 14 seconds. Then same as Morphe, he buffs your next main DPS's heavy attack damage deepen by 38% for 14 seconds. So Sanhua and Morphe, they are both considered as supports because their buff only affects the next unit that comes in battle. And of course, the next unit that comes in battle should be your main DPS. So a rotation, you can think of it something as your support is gonna buff both sub DPS and main DPS. You slot in your sub DPS, and then once you slot out your sub DPS, your main DPS is gonna gain the benefit from your sub DPS's outro skill, right? So the role of a sub DPS and exactly who do they tie, like which main DPS do you pair them with, will depend on your outro skill. So if you guys take a look over here, so the outro skill for Morphe, the next character or any character on nearby team gains a 38% heavy attack damage deepen for 14 seconds, right? So this clearly tells you that Morphe will benefit heavily for a main DPS that focuses on heavy attack damage, right? If you're a main DPS, majority of the damage output comes from heavy attack, you would preferably run Morphe with them. Then similarly for Sanhua, her outro skill is basic attack damage deepen. So it is exactly the same as Morphe, but in instead basic attack. So units that come to mind can be Ling Yang, can be Encore, where they use a lot of basic attack damage deepen, right? So really, really good. And then for Morphe, the timeless number is definitely going to be Jiyan, right? Jiyan is really, really good because majority of the ultimate, especially that, it's going to be all heavy attack, right? So those are the examples you can think of when it comes to exactly which sub DPS do you pair with which main DPS. For Auto, for Danjing, they can be considered as a sub DPS as well, but probably doesn't go as universal as compared to the sub DPS you can see, for example, Sanhua as well as one of it. So for Danjing, the reason why she's considered as a sub DPS is because this also gives a 23% havoc damage deepen. Before we go any further, I do want to point out, I've mentioned this in my beginner's guide as well. Damage deepen, it is not the same as a damage percentage. Damage deepen, you can think of it as either like a rest pen or like a vulnerability. It is a separate multiplier that adds on a further amount of damage on top of whatever this is, right? So for this havoc damage deepen, it can in fact be used as a sub DPS if you want to use stunting as a sub DPS, especially when you eventually unlock her E6. Okay, I have an E5, very relatable because I'm free to play. If you do unlock the E6, you also have a 20% attack buff for entire team. So Danjing can also be used as a sub DPS, right? So as long as this outro skill is a skill that can benefit more than just yourself, they are usually considered as a sub DPS, right? So that is going to be an example we can see over here. And then for auto, I don't have him, but yeah, that's pretty much it, right? So going back into the video, now to the non-traditional sub DPS, it's going to be Jianxing and Taoqi. Now, the reason why they are not considered as your traditional, I guess, your sub DPS is because themselves, their damage output is not as high, or they don't have as much utility, because Jianxing and Taoqi, they are both fundamentally defensive units, right? Jianxing provides a shield, Taoqi is just ridiculously tanky with an innate parry as well as a shield as well. So when it comes to absolute damage output, these sub DPSs with a more defense-oriented kit will not provide our main DPS as much damage. But that being said, if your team building is in the point where you don't care about damage output as much, right? You just want to live, you're getting absolutely destroyed by the holograms, and you want a little bit more comfort, then feel free to go ahead and slot in either Jianxing or Taoqi to make your team a little bit more tanky, a little bit more comfortable to play. But generally speaking, towards the end game, you would ideally want damage because you will want to parry. The name of the game in Wuthering Waves is towards the end game, enemy mobs will get extremely powerful. For now, you guys will not feel it in the early game because the mobs just do absolutely no damage. Towards the end game, when you're level 60, 70, 80, the damage that they're going to be dealing to you will very likely two-shot, if not one-shot you. Which is why the utility of your defensive sub DPS might not be as high, because ideally, you would want to learn the mechanics of the boss, you would want to parry, you would want to dodge, and you would just ideally not get hit or just completely negate damage, which allows you to transfer all of your sub DPS utility into offensive-oriented utilities to make the fight shorter so that there's less opportunities for the enemy to damage you, right? You parry, you dodge, you get good, and you just do as much damage as possible. Similar to how in Sekiro, it doesn't matter how high your health is, if you're just gonna get one shot, you're just gonna get one shot, right? So that is the current role. In the future, there could be a team comp. There could be a team comp that abuses a sub DPS that prefers to be more defense oriented. But for now, this is going to be the traditional, focusing on increasing our buffs, focusing on increasing our damage output, right? So that's going to be our sub DPS category. Okay, now in our last category, it's going to be our support / sustain. This category is very straightforward because there's only two units, which is going to be either Verena or Baichi, right? There's no other units in this category, only Verena or Baichi. And the reason why these two units are so important is just because they are simply irreplaceable, right? You have no other substitutes, and especially in the early game where sustain is still very important because chip damage does count, right? Clearing the main story, clearing overall mobs, clearing even like your normal wave, your wave content, chip damage does count, and you will feel a completely different world when it comes to with a healer or without a healer for now. So heals and sustains, they are very important in this game, and I would say they will still be important going forward in the future because even if you don't need the heals, their support buffs are still crucial. So what do I mean by support buffs? You can just take a look over here. So if we take a look at Verena, her kit will allow us to deal additional damage, right? She will deal additional damage through this ultimate. She will deal additional damage through the outro skill. All characters on the team gain a 15% all type damage deepen for 30 seconds, right? So because of her outro skill and her inherent kit, even if you don't need the heals that much, the fact that this buff covers every single character in your team, inclusive of your sub DPS and your main DPS, means that Verena and as well as Baichi, they can both fit a slot where it will enhance your overall team damage while still giving comfort, which is why for this category, it is pretty much the only category that fits Verena and Baichi, and you are going to be running them for almost every single team comp, except for, like I mentioned at the start, some sort of niche comps. If you're going for a defensive utility, defensive sub DPS, if you're running Jianxing, Danjing, as well as Taoqi, you can run that, then you don't really need to run a support that much. But overall, this support / sustain hybrid is going to be very, very important when it comes to team building in Wuthering Waves. There's one final category of units which I think is not that much talked about. It is a utility support. So they don't really classify as a main DPS or sub DPS, and they don't really classify as a sustain because they don't heal. But some of their kits, they have a utility that you might find some sort of a benefit to your team. For example, for Yang, her skill and her ultimate, right? She groups enemy ups together like a, what's the guy's name again? Venti? Is it Venti? Like her ultimate groups enemies up together, which may make your experience fighting the overall a lot easier. Same thing for our Rover, right? Her ultimate also has this little delayed damage, and then you can group them up. And then for Xuanwu, same thing, right? So these units, you might not expect them to sustain, nor do the highest amount of damage, but they do have some sort of utility that can make your overall experience a little bit easier. So you can still consider running them, right? So far, there isn't any specific cases where you absolutely need to run them. You can always go back to your sub DPS, main DPS and support, right? So if you want to run them, you can, but there isn't a content right now where they are particularly useful, especially for our current endgame content. So for Rover's E4, we also get a little bit more utility when it comes to healing. So you can consider raising her up and just building her as like your support / sustain hybrid, but that is only when you eventually get this specific idolate, right? And also Havoc MC, generally speaking, she feels really strong to play. We will probably be making a separate video for Havoc MC themselves, but stay tuned to that in the future, right? So the whole CN unit analysis for Jiyan, Kakarot, just stay tuned to that in the future. Alright, so that is the general gist of how team building works in Wuthering Waves, and now we're gonna go into a more specific setup that you guys can use for your considerations. If you guys don't know what the hell I just said, and you guys don't want to learn, and you guys straight up just want a team to just copy and paste and use, here is going to be an example, right? So these are your beginning units. This is assuming that you get Verena from the beginner banner or the selector, right? So they have taken into consideration that if this is from a meta perspective, everyone should have a copy of Verena just because of how universal she is and how good she is. So use that as a consideration. So initially, when you have absolutely no one to use, absolutely 0 people to use, you can use your Chixia as your main DPS, your sub DPS as Baizhi, and then your Verena as your sustain. Because the reason why they didn't include Rover over here is because in the future, if you were to build Baizhi now, you can pivot her from this sub DPS or secondary character role into the second team. So it's going to be Verena here and Baizhi over here, right? But if you were to use Rover, it's a little bit more difficult to pivot, especially when you get more units later on, because we are going to be getting a Sanhua at day 5, and eventually when you get any of this main DPS, because you should be getting your main DPS because we are getting a 2 standard 5-star service, right? So you should be changing out this main DPS for any of these 5-star main DPS. So it's going to be Calchero, you can run a Sanhua as a sub DPS, and then just run a Verena as the team, right? So generally speaking, an example is going to be Calchero, Sanhua, Verena, and that's going to be a really good team. You want to run Encore, you can use Sanhua because basic attack buff is so good. Lingyang, very good Sanhua, Calchero, all very good Sanhua. If you're going to be running Jiyan, I believe the team, I'm not sure. Yep, if you're going to be running Jiyan, then it's going to pair very well with Modify because Modify has a heavy attack up, right? As well as the fact that Modify is literally a rate up unit on Jiyan's banner, and Jiyan does rely quite a bit on heavy attacks. So this is going to be a very good pairing, and as usual, our sustain support is always going to be Verena, so not too much surprise over here. Another example, which is not using Verena, you can use your defensive sub DPS, which is Jianxing, with Chixia as well as Baizhi, right? You can also run this. This is a little bit more difficult in case if Baizhi doesn't heal as much as Verena, then Jianxing is going to be there for you to provide more shields, more defensive utility, and Chixia is going to be there to do your main DPS, right? 剑心只有在搭配竹溪卡卡罗时就会发挥到价值，但是卡卡罗带剑心是 This note basically means 剑心's biggest value is going to be with main DPS Calchero. Her biggest usage, especially for Ultra, her best mix is with Calchero. However, Calchero would prefer to not run Jianxing because he synergizes better with Sanhua. And that's why at the end of the day, it is like Jianxing's best slot is Calchero, but Calchero's best slot is not Jianxing. Alright, so that is gonna be the differential. So this is one of the rare instances where you can see 4-star units, right? Your 4-star sub DPS, because of the way their kit works, they have a better synergy than a 5-star sub DPS. So Calchero, he spams a lot of basic attacks, especially after using the ultimate, it's all basic attacks. You are gonna do exceptionally well with Sanhua using up with Calchero, right? So that's gonna be an example over here. So something to note over here if you're gonna be picking Jianxing. And one last example is gonna be, this is from the completely free-to-play team, right? So this is a completely free-to-play beginner banner slash summons. Any of this DPS works, and then Sanhua is gonna be a support slash sub DPS that you're gonna get for free by day 5. So everybody should be considering raising Sanhua just because basic attack damage deepen is a pretty universal outro skill that most of our main DPS now can use to its full efficiency. And then finally for our support, it's gonna be Baizhi, right? So if you don't want to run Arena, you can get Baizhi, then just get our main DPS from the selector, right? So those are the team's comms that you can consider using for yourselves. Hopefully you guys understand how team building in Wuthering Waves works, and hope that this video was of some help, right? With that, we've come to the end of today's content. When I engage in any further discussion, head on to Discord, discord.gg/Pokke. We're a very active community talking about Wuthering Waves on a daily basis. Check out my stream, that's twitch.tv and YouTube. I'll show me every single day. Share it on the Discord, right? So all the best for team building, all the best for your Wuthering Waves pools, all the best for your GM banner, and all the best, right? So that's all I have for today, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care.